Struggling dad. Helps lost tourist find hotel, learns she's the hotel chain's owner. He was just trying to get through another long shift, maybe scrape together enough tips for dinner. She was a tourist who looked too polished to be this lost. When their paths crossed outside a rundown diner in a fog-swept town, what began as directions to a hotel turned into something far greater. Because the hotel she was looking for, she owned it. And she was there on a secret mission that would pull this humble dad into a life he never saw coming. If you believe in quiet miracles, second chances, and the kind of love that catches you off guard, stay with us. This one's about to surprise you. The neon sign above Sullivan's Diner flickered in the late morning fog, casting a tired glow on the cracked pavement below. Inside, the coffee was strong, the eggs lukewarm, and the silence only broken by the soft clink of forks on chipped plates. Mason Kelly, 39, wiped down the same booth he always did. The one by the window with the torn vinyl seat that nobody ever picked unless the rest were full. He moved with the steady rhythm of someone who knew the dance of survival. Dawn shifts, double shifts, and those nights when his daughter fell asleep waiting for his headlights to roll into the driveway. Life wasn't easy, but it was familiar, predictable, until she walked in. Her coat was clean, cream-colored, clearly not from around here. Hair pinned up like she belonged on a magazine cover. Not standing in the doorway of a half-dead roadside diner on Route 17. She didn't order anything, just asked, with a tight smile and eyes that gave away more than she meant to, if someone could help her find the Westbrook Inn. Took a wrong turn, she said. But Mason would find out soon enough she wasn't lost at all. And she wasn't just looking for a hotel. Mason didn't ask questions. Not right away. He just grabbed the dish towel from his back pocket, nodded toward the coffee pot, and offered a quiet, "Want a cup while I grab my keys?" She hesitated. Her heels tapped once against the floor. The only sound in the room besides a faint hum from the jukebox that hadn't worked since 2009. Finally, she nodded. "Sure. Thank you." He poured her a cup, black, no sugar, and she wrapped both hands around it like she needed the warmth more than the caffeine. He watched her out of the corner of his eye as he clocked out, tossed his apron under the counter, and grabbed the beat-up leather jacket that had seen one too many winters. She looked like someone who didn't get ignored often. But here, in this forgotten slice of highway town, no one gave her more than a passing glance. Outside, the fog had thickened, curling low around the sidewalks and softening the edges of rusted pickup trucks and shuttered storefronts. Mason's truck was parked down the block, a navy blue Chevy with a dented tailgate and a temperamental heater. He unlocked the passenger door, holding it open as she climbed in, careful not to let her coat brush against anything. "Name's Mason," he said once they were buckled in. "You from around these parts?" She gave a half smile. "Not even close." Her voice was warm, cultured, with just enough edge to suggest she'd had to use it to get what she needed. "Claire," she said finally. "Claire Martin." He nodded, like the name meant nothing. Because to him, it didn't. Not yet. As they drove, she kept glancing out the window like she was looking for something that had already passed them by. The town was small, a smattering of old brick buildings, a few scattered gas stations, a library with more cobwebs than books. Mason turned onto Main, then cut across Sycamore, the roads familiar as the back of his hand. He didn't need GPS to find the Westbrook. He delivered pies to the kitchen there during a side hustle last winter. "It's a nice place," he said casually, his eyes on the road. "Bit fancy for a town like this." Claire didn't answer right away. Then, "That's kind of the point." He glanced at her, puzzled. She looked straight ahead, jaw tight. When they reached the hotel, the fog was starting to lift. The building stood tall against the gray sky, all white stone and dark shutters, a regal misfit in a town of peeling paint and pawn shops. Mason parked at the curb, turning to ask if she needed anything else. But she was already out of the truck. She paused at the top of the steps. Looking back at him, "You didn't have to help me. You know." Didn't seem right to let someone wander around lost. He shrugged. "Not in this town." She looked like she wanted to say something more. But then the front doors opened, and a sharply dressed man in a black suit stepped out, his face pale when he saw her. "Mrs. Martin," he said, flustered. "We weren't expecting—" "I know." She cut in, her voice suddenly cool. That was the point. Mason watched the exchange, confusion knitting across his brow. He waited, thinking maybe she'd turn around, say goodbye, something, but she didn't. She walked through the doors without looking back. He sat there a moment longer, engine idling, heart thudding with a strange sense of unfinished business. Then he drove off, not knowing that the woman he'd just dropped off wasn't just a guest at the Westbrook Inn. She was the one signing the paychecks. And she'd already decided this wasn't the last time she was going to see Mason Kelly. Not by a long shot. The next morning started like any other. Mason was back at Sullivan's before sunrise, prepping eggs and wiping down counters that would be greasy again within the hour. It was a Tuesday, which meant the same 6 regulars would fill their booths by 7:30. And if he was lucky, he'd get out with enough in tips to cover groceries and maybe a tank of gas. He was mid-order, scribbling extra crispy bacon on a notepad when the bell above the door rang. He didn't look up, not until the silence hit, not until every head in the diner turned like they were watching something out of place. Mason glanced toward the door, and there she was. Claire, not lost this time, not nervous, just calm, composed, and walking straight toward him in a blazer that probably cost more than his truck was worth. He wiped his hands on his apron and met her halfway. "You forget your directions again?" he asked, half joking, half confused. She smiled faintly, eyes scanning the room before settling on him. "I didn't come for directions," she said. "I came for you." The diner went quiet. Even Hank, who hadn't looked up from his crossword puzzle in 7 years, was now staring. Mason cleared his throat. "Look, if it's about yesterday, it's about a job." Claire interrupted. "And no, I'm not hiring at the front desk." She handed him a card, the paper thick, inexpensive. "There's a position opening at the Westbrook, something that requires a little more honesty than experience. I think you'd be good at it." He stared at the card, then at her. "Claire, I think about it," she said before he could finish. "Come by this afternoon. Ask for me." Then, just like that, she turned and left, leaving behind a room full of curious eyes and one very stunned, single dad holding a business card he didn't know what to do with. That afternoon, Mason stood in front of the Westbrook Inn again, wearing his only clean shirt and jeans that didn't have a rip in the knee. He told himself he wasn't going to show. He had no business walking into a place like that. But something about the way she'd looked at him, the way she hadn't pitied him, hadn't patronized him, stuck. He pushed the door open, heart thudding hard, and was greeted by polished floors, chandeliers, and a receptionist who smiled like he didn't belong. "Mrs. Martin is expecting you," the woman said, already on the phone before he could introduce himself. A moment later, Claire stepped into the lobby, her heels clicking softly on the marble tile. "Follow me," she said, leading him through a maze of hallways until they reached an office that smelled like lemon polish and quiet power. "I need someone local," she explained, "who understands people, who doesn't flinch at hard work. This place isn't just a hotel, Mason. It's a community. And right now, that community is falling apart because everyone here thinks I'm just some corporate transplant with too much money and not enough heart." She paused, folding her arms. "But they'll listen to you." Mason took a deep breath, unsure if this was a mistake or a moment that could actually mean something. "I don't know anything about running a hotel." Claire's expression didn't shift. "You know how to show up. You know how to help someone who doesn't ask for it. You know how to stay when it'd be easier to walk away. That's what I need. And somehow, even though every part of him screamed he was out of his depth, Mason nodded. All right, he said. I'll give it a shot. Claire smiled. Not big, not triumphant, just enough. Because that was the moment it started, not just the job, not just the partnership, but the unraveling of something bigger neither of them could name yet. Mason's first week at the Westbrook felt like learning to swim by getting thrown into deep water. Everything about the place screamed precision, white linens folded to military corners, bellhops who moved like ghosts, guests who spoke softly but looked like they could buy the whole town if they wanted. Mason didn't fit, not on the surface. His boots were scuffed, his jacket had a broken zipper, and he still said ma'am out of habit. But Claire didn't seem to mind. In fact, she didn't just tolerate his presence, she welcomed it. She made it clear he wasn't there to pretend to be something he wasn't. I hired you because you're not polished, she told him during a walk through the garden courtyard one afternoon. Because you say what you mean and do what you promise. That's rare. He started by shadowing the maintenance crew, fixing leaky faucets, replacing busted bulbs, tightening the kinds of things no one notices until they break. It was honest work, the kind his hands understood. Then she started pulling him into meetings, not just ones about pipes or parking lots, but ones about staffing, training, guest feedback. At first, he kept quiet. He wasn't used to boardrooms or PowerPoint presentations. But Claire kept asking him questions no one else seemed to think mattered. What do you think the guests really need? How would someone like you feel walking into this lobby? And when he answered, plain, unvarnished, sometimes blunt, she listened. More than that, she acted. She had the kind of authority that didn't need raising her voice. The kind that made people straighten up just by entering the room. Still, not everyone was thrilled by his presence. The general manager, a stiff-collared man named Preston with a penchant for three-syllable words in passive-aggressive emails, didn't hide his disapproval. You're giving this man far too much leash, he told Claire once. Unaware Mason was standing in the hallway just outside her office. He doesn't have the credentials. He's not qualified to advise on guest experience. Claire didn't raise her voice, didn't even flinch. Preston, she said calmly, what he doesn't have in certificates, he makes up for in something you clearly lack. Empathy. Mason hadn't meant to hear that, but he carried it with him the rest of the day, maybe even longer. By the end of the second week, he knew most of the staff by name. He'd learned how the head chef liked his knives stacked, where the old boiler groaned in the middle of the night, and how to fix the vintage elevator with a paperclip and a prayer. Guests started to recognize him. Too, not because he wore a name tag or gave them champagne, but because he was the guy who helped the elderly couple with their luggage before they even asked, who held the door open even when he was off the clock. The kind of man who made a place feel warmer without saying much. But it wasn't just the job changing. It was the time he spent with Claire. They never labeled it, never called them dates. But every now and then, she'd invite him to walk the grounds with her after hours. Or they'd sit under the covered terrace with mugs of tea and the kind of quiet that only happens between two people who have nothing to prove. She told him about her father, the man who built the Westbrook brand from a single bed and breakfast in Maine into a national empire. About how she lost him too soon. About the pressure she faced trying to preserve his legacy in a world that kept asking her to sell it off. I don't want more, she admitted one night, voice low. I just want it to mean something. Mason didn't try to fix her. He didn't promise things he couldn't deliver. But he stayed. And sometimes, that was enough. And then came the letter. It arrived in a cream envelope with no return address. Slipped under Claire's office door late one evening. Mason found her reading it. Face unreadable, her fingers tight around the paper. Everything's about to change, she said, barely above a whisper. The board, they're not happy. She folded the letter, slid it into a drawer, and looked at him like she was standing at the edge of something she couldn't see the bottom of. "They want me out. Mason." And just like that, the ground shifted, because this wasn't just about a job anymore. It was about loyalty, about the kind of quiet war that starts when you finally have something worth fighting for. Mason didn't say much after Claire told him about the letter. He didn't have to. He just stood there, jaw set, arms crossed, the way he did when life threw something at him he couldn't punch or fix with a wrench. Claire had seen that look before once, when a guest screamed at a housekeeper and Mason stepped in without hesitation, not with fists, but with the kind of calm authority that made people listen. Now, that same steel had settled behind his eyes, and she knew he wouldn't let her go down alone. Still, that night as they locked up the Westbrook and walked out into the parking lot under a sky dusted with stars, she looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but in spirit, like the weight of legacy was finally crushing something inside her that even money couldn't protect. The next morning, everything felt tighter. The staff were polite but wary. The air buzzed with rumor, and Preston seemed to be everywhere at once, his clipboard tucked under his arm like a sword, his smug smirk barely concealed. He made a show of inspecting the grounds, pausing dramatically to whisper into his earpiece or glare at the lobby flowers like they were responsible for a declining stock price. Mason watched it all in silence, then pulled Claire aside by the service hallway, where the scent of lemon cleaner and old pipe smoke hung heavy. "Tell me what they're really after," he said, voice low but firm. Claire sighed, leaned back against the wall. "They think I'm too emotional, too invested. They want to sell the property to a luxury conglomerate. Flip it, strip it, slap a new name on the building and move on. They don't care what this place means to people. They just see numbers." That afternoon, Mason skipped his usual rounds. Instead, he walked the hotel from top to bottom, every hallway, every maintenance closet, every staff break room. He listened to the pastry chef worrying about job security, to the bellhop who said he'd lose his apartment if hours got cut, to the woman who'd cleaned rooms there since Claire's father ran the place and still remembered when they served breakfast on real china. And slowly, something started to form, not a plan exactly, but a purpose, because it wasn't just Claire fighting for the Westbrook, it was everyone who depended on it to survive. That night, he drove home and sat on the porch steps with his daughter, Leah, curled beside him under a threadbare blanket. She didn't say much, just leaned her head on his shoulder and let him think. And Mason thought about all the times life had kicked him sideways, about how no one had shown up for him back then, about how maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to show up for someone else in a way that mattered. The next day, he came in early, pulled Claire into the office before her first meeting. "We fight this," he said. "You're not just some CEO in a nice suit. You're the reason this place still has heart. You've given me a chance when no one else would. So now we give the board something they can't ignore." Claire raised a brow. "And what's that?" "Proof," Mason said, "that this place is worth more than the numbers, that it changes lives." With her hesitant blessing, Mason went to work. He organized the staff, not to protest, not to riot, but to speak. They recorded testimonials, staff and guests alike, talking about how the Westbrook wasn't just a hotel, but a second chance, a safe place, a home. He called in favors from local businesses who thrived on Westbrook's tourism, gathered letters from families who'd celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, recoveries there. Claire compiled it all into a presentation, one that felt less like a sales pitch and more like a love letter to everything the board couldn't see. When the board arrived for their review meeting, a sleek caravan of luxury sedans and sharp suits, they were met with something unexpected. Not protest signs, but open doors. Not shouting, but sincerity. The lobby was full of people who had shown up not for drama, but for Claire, for what she built, for the future they believed she deserved to protect. Mason stood at the back of the room during the presentation, hands jammed into his jacket pockets, heart pounding like he was the one on trial. Claire spoke with poise, but her eyes kept flicking toward him, like she was grounding herself in the only truth that mattered. And when the last video ended, the boardroom fell silent, not because they were impressed, but because, for the first time, they understood. This wasn't about one hotel. It was about the people behind it, the people who made it matter. And Mason knew, right then, win or lose, they had already changed the story. The vote didn't come immediately. The board filed out of the conference room like a wave receding from the shore, tight-lipped, unreadable, some with softened expressions, others with clipped nods that said nothing and everything at once. Claire stood at the head of the long table, her hands folded tightly, her posture perfect. But Mason could see it in her eyes, the fatigue, the fear barely held together by composure. He didn't say anything, just walked up, handed her a glass of water, and stood beside her as the room emptied. She took it with a soft thank you, her fingers brushing his for half a second longer than they needed to. They spent the next few days in a kind of suspended animation. Work carried on, rooms were clean, meals served, light bulbs replaced, but underneath the routine, there was a hum of tension. Everyone was waiting for a call, an email, a verdict that would decide not just the fate of a building, but of jobs, lives, futures. Mason kept busy, maybe more than usual. He replaced the old sink in the employee lounge, fixed a faulty heating vent on the second floor, helped the kitchen rewire a broken oven. He needed to move. If he stopped, he'd start thinking, and if he started thinking, he'd spiral into every what if he couldn't control. One afternoon, while replacing a loose floorboard outside the spa, Claire came looking for him. She stood there in a trench coat that swayed in the breeze, her hair pulled back, her expression unreadable. "They called," she said simply. Mason sat back on his heels, hammer still in hand. And Claire took a breath, the kind that held both relief and disbelief. "They voted in my favor. I keep the Westbrook. Full operational control. No sale, no rebranding." Mason didn't move at first, just blinked up at her, processing the words like they were in a foreign language. Then he stood, wiped his hands on his jeans, and let out a low whistle. "You did it." "We did," she corrected softly. They celebrated that night not with champagne and tuxedos, but with pizza on paper plates in the employee lounge, music from someone's Bluetooth speaker echoing off the tile. The staff laughed louder than usual, hugged longer, and for once, nobody was checking the clock. Claire sat beside Mason on the worn leather couch, their shoulders just touching. She was laughing at something the pastry chef said when Mason turned to her, his voice quiet beneath the noise. "You're not gonna leave, are you? Now that it's yours for good." She looked at him, her smile fading into something deeper. "No," she said, "not anymore." The weeks that followed weren't perfect. There were still issues, repairs to make, budgets to balance, personalities to manage, but something had shifted. People walked a little taller. Guests lingered in the lobby longer. Staff started offering ideas instead of just complaints. The Westbrook wasn't just surviving, it was becoming something more. And at the center of it was Claire. Still polished, still firm, but no longer alone. And Mason, who now split his time between maintenance and a new role Claire had created just for him, Director of Community Relations. "You speak their language," she told him. "You make people feel like they belong." He'd scoffed at the title, but secretly, it meant more than he let on. It was a Thursday afternoon when Claire asked him to walk with her. They took the long path behind the hotel, where the willow trees bent over a small pond that reflected the sky. "I've been thinking," she said, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. "About what happens next?" Mason nodded. Not pushing, She paused by the water's edge. This place, it used to be my father's dream. Then it became my responsibility. But now, I think it's something we're building together. She looked at him then, really looked. I don't want to build it alone. Mason didn't answer right away. He reached down, picked up a stone, and tossed it across the pond. It skipped 3 times before sinking. Neither do I, he finally said. And just like that, something unspoken became real. It wasn't a grand gesture. No fireworks. Just 2 people who had fought their way through storm after storm, finally standing on solid ground. Together. The holidays came quickly after that. Wreaths hung from the wrought iron balconies of the Westbrook. Garlands stretched across the reception desk. And a 10-foot pine tree sparkled in the lobby with ornaments donated by staff and townsfolk alike. Mason wasn't much for decoration, but even he had to admit it felt good. It felt like home. Leah spent her afternoons curled up in the reading nook with a stack of library books, and Claire made it a habit to join them when she could, often showing up with mugs of hot chocolate and stories from her childhood that made Leah laugh in that high, bright way Mason hadn't heard in years. One night, after the last guest checked in and the fire in the main hearth crackled low, Claire pulled Mason aside. She held a small box in her hand, wrapped in deep green paper and tied with twine. I know it's early, she said, smiling, but I couldn't wait. Mason raised a brow but took the box, unfolding the paper carefully. Inside was a single brass key on a ribbon. It looked old, worn, but polished to a shine. Room 302, Claire said softly. It used to be my father's office. We've converted it into an apartment. It's yours now. You and Leah, if you want it. Mason stared at the key, heart thudding. He thought about their cramped rental, the drafty windows, the leaky roof he never had time to fix. And then he looked at Claire, standing there like she'd just handed him more than a room, like she'd offered him a place to belong. Are you sure? He asked. I've never been more sure, she said. They moved in a week later. Room 302 had been transformed, wooden floors polished to a warm glow, bookshelves lining one wall, a small kitchen that smelled faintly of pine and fresh paint. Leah claimed the lofted nook by the window, calling it her castle tower. And Mason stood in the middle of the room that first night, overwhelmed by the quiet, steady truth of it all. They weren't guests here. They were home. It wasn't perfect. Of course, there were still days when the pipes rattled or the power flickered or a guest decided to be impossible. But every time the weight of it started to settle on Claire's shoulders again, Mason was there. Sometimes with a wrench, sometimes with a joke, sometimes with nothing but a presence that reminded her she didn't have to carry it alone. And slowly, without either of them naming it, something began to root itself between them, deeper than gratitude, more certain than luck. A trust forged not in the grand, but in the daily thing. And in that quiet stretch between December snow and spring thaw, Mason Kelly and Claire Martin stopped being a story of a stranger and a tourist. They became something far more rare. They became a team, a family, a future. Spring brought more than wildflowers to the edges of the Westbrook property. It brought weddings, full bookings, and a long overdue sense of peace. The inn buzzed with life, not from chaos, but from the rhythm of something finally clicking into place. Mason now wore a name badge he didn't mind, community director. A title that once made him chuckle, but now felt like it fit better than any work shirt he'd ever owned. Claire thrived too, not as the woman fighting to prove herself to a boardroom, but as someone who had found her purpose in people, not policies. One evening, long after the last table had been cleared and the lobby lights dimmed to a soft gold, Claire and Mason sat beneath the gazebo out back. Leah had fallen asleep earlier in the lounge with a book on her chest, the way she always did when the world felt safe. Fireflies blinked lazily over the lawn. Claire turned to Mason, barefoot, wine glass in hand, her voice quiet but sure. You know, she said, if someone had told me the man who fixed my directions would end up fixing everything else too, I'd have called them crazy. Mason smiled, shook his head. I didn't fix anything. I just showed up. She reached over, laced her fingers through his. That was everything. And maybe that was the point. That the biggest miracles didn't come with fanfare or headlines. Sometimes, they came wrapped in the fog outside a diner. In a ride offered without a reason, in a key to a room that became a home. Mason hadn't been looking for a fresh start. Claire hadn't been looking for a partner. But life has a way of finding you when you least expect it. And for the single dad and the woman who once got lost looking for a hotel, they'd ended up finding exactly what neither of them knew they were missing: each other.